Okay, in the first video in this series on Walt Whitman, we talked about some of the themes of the poems in the collection and as they are expressed by Whitman in the preface. This this second part is going to be a little more technical because there are going to be some assignments where you write about these poems. We're going to talk about basically the organization of the book and some of the challenges of citing the poems in it. I love this image by Louis Daniel. It's on the cover of the Penguin edition of Leaves of Grass. It's from the early 20th century. I think it's great. Subtly erotic, like some of the poems in Leaves of Grass. So here is, on the left, you see the cover of the 1855 edition. The poems, when the book first appeared in 1855, the poems did not have titles. So the titles in your copy, enclosed in square brackets, were added later in the evolution of the collection, and that's why the titles are in square brackets, because in the 1855 edition they did not have titles. There are 12 poems in the book. The first and longest of which, and the most famous one, Song of Myself, is pages 25 to 86 of the Penguin edition. And the other 11 poems are as follows: A Song for Occupations, To Think of Time, The Sleepers, I Sing the Body Electric, Faces, Song of the Answerer, Europe, A Boston Ballad, There Was a Child Went Forth, Who Learns My Lesson Complete, and Great Are the Myths. So those are the titles of all 12 of the poems. And this is a screenshot from page 81 of the Penguin edition of the 1855 Leaves of Grass. We're looking at part of section 46 and the start of section 47 from Song of Myself. And just to help you understand what you're seeing on the page here, these numbers on the right, these are line numbers. Line numbers are indicated in 5-line intervals. So you'll see line 1225 is there, and then the next numbered line is 1230 down here. Song of Myself has a total of 1,336 lines. And so actually when you look at the page here, we're very, very far into the poem by the time we get to these sections. There are 52 sections total. Some of Whitman's lines are actually longer than what fits within the margins of the page. So when a line runs into the right margin, it is continued on the line below, and a hanging indent will indicate that it is counted the same as the line above. Now that might sound a little confusing, so I'm going to show you. We're going to look at line 1230, and that line actually starts right here, to jump off in the midst of the sea. That's where line 1230 begins, but you'll notice that down below there's a hanging indent, and that means that we're still on line 1230. So to jump off in the midst of the sea and rise again and nod to me and shout and laughingly dash with your hair, all of that is line 1230. So what I want you to do is try to identify where line 1224 starts. Just take a minute to look at the page. Where would you say line 1224 begins? Actually begins, but as soon as you sleep and renew yourself in sweet clothes, that's the beginning of line 1224, which actually takes up 3 lines on the page. A little more than half the poems on Leaves of Grass, and Song of Myself is one of them, are subdivided into sections. And these are identified by a number enclosed in square brackets, because in the 1855 edition, they were not divided into sections. And these square bracketed numbers are in the left-hand margin of the page. Song of Myself has 52 of these sections. And this is important for citation purposes, as you'll see in a moment. So now that we've talked a little bit about the structure of the poem and line breakage, let's talk a little bit about how to cite the poems in Leaves of Grass properly. You will have a number of homework assignments, like I said, that ask you to do this. So we need to talk about some of the different problems that can arise when citing a complicated text like this. So because Leaves of Grass contains a dozen poems, as we discussed, if you quote from a poem and it is not clear to the reader which poem the passage comes from, your parenthetical citation should include the title of the poem, followed by the section number and line numbers, separated by a period with no space before or after the period. So here are some examples. These are 3 different examples. I'll give you different scenarios here. So in the first scenario here, the reader already knows that you're quoting from Song of Myself, so you don't need to include the title in the parenthetical citation. Just the section number, you'll see the period there, and then the line numbers. In another scenario, maybe you're quoting multiple poems by Walt Whitman, and you want to make sure your reader knows which poem you're quoting. So in this example, we do include the title of the poem enclosed in quotation marks, Song of Myself, followed by the section and line numbers just as above. In yet another scenario, maybe you're quoting not just Walt Whitman, but other poets. So it might be appropriate in some situations to actually include Whitman himself, followed by a comma. So Whitman, comma, title of the poem, followed by the section and line numbers. And there are a few other scenarios as well, but these would be the 3 that would be the most common. Most of the time, I would expect you just to use the first 2 for the assignments in this class. So I'm going to give you some examples of quotations with citations at the end of them, parenthetical citations. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the extra things that you need to think about, that you'll need to include in your quotations when quoting poetry. And we're going to be looking at these 3 lines that you see highlighted in red on the left there, lines 12, 25, 26, and 27. And here's the first example. Again, this is just a screenshot of a document I made in Word, and I just used simple attachment, Whitman writes, and then I quoted those 3 lines continuously. And there's my parenthetical citation at the end of it, which is correct, assuming, of course, that my reader knows that I'm quoting Song of Myself here. So first, I want to talk about forward slashes. If you look at my example, you'll notice there are two forward slashes. There's the first one, there's the second one. That's how you indicate line breaks when quoting 3 or fewer lines of poetry. If there were a stanza break in there, then I would use 2 forward slashes. And I want you to pay attention to the spacing. If you don't space these right, the forward slashes can just disappear into your quotation. Be very hard for a reader to spot. So you always want to put a space before and a space after the forward slash. And the same with the 2 forward slashes. Space, forward slash, and then space to indicate a stanza break. You'll also notice that I keep Whitman's capitalization. So he capitalizes the first word of each line. He does this throughout all of his poems. And because you're quoting poetry, 2 or more lines of poetry, you want to maintain that capitalization. One other thing that you might notice is that I have an ellipsis at the end. Now, this is something we normally don't do when we're quoting prose, but it's more common when quoting poetry, because if you quote 2 or more consecutive lines of poetry, you should use an ellipsis to indicate if you've cut material from the beginning or ending of a line. So if you look at line 1227 on the left there, you must habit yourself to the dazzle of the light and of every moment of your life. I cut the quote after the word light, And because I did that, I've got to let the reader know that this is not a complete line. So I put the ellipsis in there for that reason. So one way to simplify your quotations is not to use attachment methods. Sometimes it's really useful to do it, but integrating quotations often will eliminate the need for using forward slashes, ellipses, and capital letters. So I quoted the same lines in this example, but notice there are no forward slashes, no capital letters, and no ellipses. So I took contemptible dreams, wash the gum, and the dazzle of the light. I took those deliberately from all three lines, so my parenthetical citation remains the same, but I just took keywords or phrases that I liked, that I thought were important, and I integrated them into my own sentence. And again, this is a good way to economize your writing and avoid long, complicated citations. So if you want to quote something that's longer than 3 lines, 4 more lines. So let's say I decide I'm going to quote 2 stanzas here, which I highlighted on the left, and then you can see my document on the right. It looks a lot different. So because it's 4 lines, it's actually 6 lines of poetry. I have to format it as a hanging quote using complex attachment. So here is my hanging quote. Again, the whole thing has a hanging indent, 1/2 inch from my left margin. And with hanging quotes, when you're quoting poetry, you must include the stanza break. So I've got an extra line in there to make the stanza break visible, since I'm not using forward slashes anymore, since this is a block quotation. Another important thing to point out about this is that I changed the hanging indent. So if you look at line 1230 on the left, you'll see that the right margin ends with the word me. So to jump off in the midst of the sea and rise again and nod to me, and then the next line starts and shout, well, in my document, my right margin extends further than it does on the page in my source, so I can actually extend that line out a little further. So my line 1230 ends with the word and then I can skip to the next line with laughingly dash with your hair, and so I have a new hanging indent. So again, you don't repeat the line endings with Whitman's free verse. It's just a line that goes all the way to the right, and then you have to create a new hanging indent that starts on a different word. So those are some of the unique aspects of quoting poetry. There's more, but this is a good start. It's quite a lot, actually. And that ends this presentation on Walt Whitman and writing about Leaves of Grass.